Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now Mafia 2 is one of the best games I've ever played. It's got great characters, a decent story, and to top it off, it runs on almost anything hardware wise. When I found out about the definitive edition of the game, or remastered version as some are calling it, I couldn't wait to re-download it from my Steam library and play through it yet again, for free I should add, because I had bought the original, now titled Mafia 2 Classic Edition, through the same platform. Originally, 2K suggested a Pentium D or Athlon X2 3600 Plus, along with a Radeon 2600 or GeForce 8600 and 1.5 gigs of RAM as the minimum requirements for Mafia 2 back in 2010. These are probably a bit light, but the game did release on 7th gen consoles too, so it doesn't really take too much to get it running at 30 frames per second. We actually messed around with Mafia 2 not long ago, installing a mod called Old Time Reality, which made a few visual changes to the game, changes that a lot of you didn't really like. I myself thought it looked pretty good, but there's nothing quite like the original or vanilla version to satisfy a thirst for nostalgia. This is why when I heard that Mafia 2's definitive edition didn't seem to change much visually, according to a lot of user reviews, I was quite relieved. Retaining the aesthetic of the original game, while making a few texture and lighting tweaks, is fine in my book. The PC hardware enthusiast part of my brain wasn't quite as easily convinced though. I mean, here is this definitive edition that is 4.5 times the size of the original, and also according to the minimum requirements needs way more powerful hardware to run smoothly, all while offering very little in terms of an upgrade in return. Personally, it's the remaster of the original Mafia that I think we're all anticipating, and it's clear that this is where most of the developers' focus is. It looks incredible. Oh yeah, and there's also a Mafia 3 definitive edition out now too, which I don't think changes much either. Back to Mafia 2 though, and it's time to check out the performance. How does the definitive edition perform in comparison to the original game? Well, first up, it's the turn of my everyday hardware, the Ryzen 5 1600, 16 gigs of DDR4, and the RTX 2070. The footage you see on screen here is from the game's built-in benchmark. With the original, or now classic game, we were seeing over 150 FPS on average with the highest settings. The definitive edition adds a couple of graphical options, but again everything has been set to the highest respective level. The frame rate difference is quite substantial, but the graphical difference isn't. Actually, side by side it is clear to see what has been improved, and there are certainly some areas that look a little better. This immediately makes me wonder though how older graphics cards will cope, and just to clarify, although I feel it's probably obvious, my CPU isn't overclocked to 10,000 GHz. This seems to be some sort of misread system statistic. The average frame rate with the remastered game was 95, still very good. But one thing about the original game is that it runs quite well on graphics cards like the 9800 GT. Even at 1080p, a 512MB 9800 GT will mean that we'll see a fairly healthy frame rate. It's not quite a solid 60, but there will definitely be a lot of moments where the frame rate goes above and beyond this. Take for example the opening level. The average frame rate was calculated using the in-game benchmark that goes for all of the cards tested today, which is designed to push the hardware, though outside of the benchmark test you may see 70 or 80 FPS during certain missions. We even hit 100 frames per second a couple of times. The re-release of the game doesn't treat our old hardware quite as kindly. What I mean by that is that the game didn't actually run. We got a warning about this when double clicking the exe file, and I thought the game might launch regardless if we chose to ignore it, but after selecting start, nothing happened. I waited a few moments to see if the game would eventually fire up, but it wasn't even running in Task Manager, so unfortunately it seems like a DX11 supported GPU is required now, which is what I suspected from the start, to be honest. Okay, so now let's see what the GTX 670 can do. A once high-end graphics card, this 2GB GPU can still handle itself fairly well in some titles, though it is of course much better suited to older games. The original Mafia 2 ran very nicely. I'm showing you different gameplay scenes to mix things up a bit, but as I said before, the average figures were taken from the in-game benchmark, which is present in both the classic and definitive editions and hasn't changed. Maxed out, the original still looks very nice, especially with anti-aliasing and shadows turned up. When it came to testing the remaster, MSAA and post-AA were turned off to give our card the best chance. I'll show you the effect of increasing anti-aliasing options at the end of the video. On the GTX 670, the definitive edition will still run well, again exceeding 60 FPS outside of the benchmark test. From what we've seen, I think the best bet here, unless you have a relatively new or powerful graphics card, is to stick with the original title for a guaranteed 60 frames per second because it still does look very good. Finally, it's the turn of an AMD card. The so-called entry-level RX 5500 XT. With the original game, we saw a lot of stutter, which was quite surprising. Sure, the frame rate was smooth enough on average, but there were so many little drops and freezes that it felt a bit unplayable with VSync turned off. Nvidia cards seem to be better at handling older games from what I've experienced. If we switch again to the remastered gameplay, we do see a drop in the average frame rate, but the stutter and dips have gone. Personally, I definitely download this version of the game if you have a newer AMD card that suffers when running the original, because while we do lose a few frames, or a lot of frames, the horrible judder has all disappeared. So to finalise then, I turned the MSAA and post-AA all the way up. I was curious to see how the game would run at the absolute max settings on this card. Now older cards like the previously tested GTX 670 won't handle this very well, and even with the 5500 XT the frame rate dips below 60 on a few occasions. It does look great and clears up some aliasing issues that are present in the now classic version, but it hits the FPS pretty hard. Running the original at a higher resolution using something like virtual super resolution would get rid of jagged lines and may even still perform better than the remastered version with everything turned up. To conclude, if you own Mafia 2 on Steam, then you've got the definitive copy in your library and it's worth downloading just to try it out. Honestly, it doesn't look significantly better than the original and also comes with a few issues of its own. There are certainly some graphical glitches too that need working out, hopefully with future patches. It's a shame that older cards like the 9800 GT won't work, but I guess that's just part of a definitive edition after all. Anyway, I hope this video has given you some idea of how Mafia 2's re-release differs from the now classic version, but I'd love to hear about how performance has changed for you with your hardware in the comments below. If you've taken the time to compare the versions for yourself, of course. All that's left to say now is thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. I have had fun testing Mafia 2 today, and personally, I would still play the definitive edition if you have a powerful enough graphics card, because there are some subtle but nice visual changes in there, and you never know, any graphical glitches that are occurring now may be ironed out with future updates if they haven't been already at the time you're watching this video. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.